The best advice I ever heard was in a sermon, the first thing you have to do is show people Jesus, show Jesus getting in trouble, show people how Jesus gets out of trouble. That's what you do in every sermon. Here's Jesus. Here's Jesus acting in a way you don't want Jesus to act.
Yeah.
Oh, but look what Jesus did.
Yeah.
That seems about right. There needs to be some drama.
He was a troublemaker, and then he figured his way out.
Yeah.
Like when he just kind of did about to throw. I've always wondered in that scripture when they're about to throw him off the cliff.
And he walks through them, yes.
He walks through them. How do you picture that in your mind? I mean, what's going on in that sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of it, I think, is just, so obviously you can have kind of miraculous versions of that, right? So the way in the 40-day window after resurrection, he'll appear in a locked room miraculously. But I tend to picture that not as a miracle, but just as him walking away and having such an air about him that people somehow realize, oh, he's going to walk away and there's nothing we can do about it. So, but it is an interesting, like if you're a filmmaker, how would you film it? It'd be an interesting question.
No, I think that's a great take on it. It's almost like he has an air about him. And because you're right, we always think that everything is so miraculous, but maybe it didn't appear miraculous. It just appeared very common and ordinary, but something extraordinary is taking place in the moment.
Yes, that's right. I think this is true of everything that happens in Jesus' life, that even when there were miracles, they were the kinds of miracles that other people could still question. And this is one of the reasons, in our tribe, sometimes we overvalue what a miracle can do, not overvalue the good that happens to people. Like that's good. But sometimes we can overvalue the idea of the miracle or overvalue what we think a miracle could bring about. That, if we just had more miracles, more people would believe. But Jesus, read the Gospels. Jesus is doing miracles all the time. And people are drawn to the drama of it, what we might call the theater of it. But he says, like, you're following me because I multiply fishes and loaves. Like, you're not really interested in me. And then there are certain kinds of miracles that they request. And Jesus says, it's a wicked and perverse generation that asks for these kinds of signs. And his miracles, even by people that receive them, the man born blind, all the years growing up, we would hear sermons about this lie, and the man born blind says, I don't know. All I know is I was blind and now I see. And we took that to be testimony about the work of God in our life. We may not be able to theologize about it, but we know what God has done for us. That's the way we took that line, right? But in the gospel itself, like if you read the story, here's this man who's born blind. Jesus sees him and heals him. The man doesn't request it, doesn't cry out to Jesus for healing. Jesus just heals him.
Yeah.
It immediately causes an uproar, right? Everybody is disturbed that he's done this on the Sabbath. What does it mean? We've never seen this kind of thing before. And the man's parents essentially disown him because they want to stay in the synagogue. And then the rulers come to the man and said, what's happened here? And he says, I don't know. All I know is I was blind and now I see. And it is a kind of testimony, but I think that the way to hear it is he's genuinely stupefied. He has no idea.
Yeah.
I was just sitting there begging, as I do every day.
So it's not apparent to him this is what this actually is.
What has actually happened. And because they ask him, do you believe? And he's like, I don't know. All I know is I was blind and now I see. And then Jesus comes to him and says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he says, show him to me and I will. And Jesus says, I who speak to you am he. And so even that late in the story, the man still hasn't put together who this is and what's really happened.
So we kind of have it in reverse. We think that this is a statement of certainty, but really it's a statement of uncertainty.
Absolutely. He's essentially saying, he's shrugging to say, I have no idea. All I can tell you is, all of my life until yesterday, I couldn't see a thing. And then suddenly some stranger walks up to me and now I can see. But he still hasn't put together, who is this? What does it mean? And the people around him do not. Like even the Pharisees are divided over it. Some of them say, you can't do this kind of miracle without God. Others are saying, but you wouldn't do it on the Sabbath. So they're divided. He is separated from his parents. The disciples are still trying to figure out who sinned, this man or his parents. So what happens around the miracle is just confusion. What does it mean? Is it real? And this is why Bonhoeffer in his Christology lectures, which are I think, the most important work that he did theologically. He makes the point about Jesus' miracles that they actually obscure his identity for people who do not have faith. So that the miracles aren't some kind of proof of anything, of his divinity or his mission even. Because if you don't already have faith in him, you either dismiss the miracle as false or you attribute it to evil, right? You're casting out by these spirits by Beelzebub, or you take offense in one way or another at him, which is why Bonhoeffer says that the miracles deepen the incognito. So Bonhoeffer's drawing this idea that Jesus' mission is in hiddenness. Like, so in the Gospel of Mark, we get the messianic secret. Don't tell anyone what I've done for you. And the work of incarnation happens in secret. It's hidden and revealed on the Mount of Transfiguration, revealed in those 40 days between resurrection and ascension. But it's hidden from the world who this really is, right? And Bonhoeffer says when he does miracles, it deepens the hiddenness. It doesn't expose Jesus, because what it exposes is whether or not people have faith in him. Yep. Do they recognize who he is? And over and over and over, people do not, even when he's doing stupendous works.
Yeah. How does it play into how we read the text today? Because when we read the text today, we often look at this as a proof of certainty.
Absolutely.
And we miss the hiddenness that you're talking about, how you're saying incarnation is wrapped in hiddenness. Where do you think these readings today come from, where we're like, this is certain, this is proof, and we're using it almost in an apologetic sort of way?
Yeah. That's the key, is that we tend to think of miracles as the ultimate apologetic performance of God, and in that way, we're desperate to have what Elijah had on Mount Carmel, and this shows up in almost all of our readings, right? So we were looking for these dramatic moments where God shows up and shows off and proves us right over against those who are against us and over against those who doubt. So Mount Carmel, Elijah, builds the altar, calls fire down from heaven. And if you stop the movie at that scene, it's a victory, because, he calls down fire. They do not. The prophets of Baal do not. And God is answered, and the people begin to shout, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." Right? And so if you just stop right there, it looks like Elijah has done this feat of kind of witness that's undeniable. And we love that. Like we thrill at the thought that we could do the same. But of course, the story doesn't actually end there.
Right. There's a lot more.
There's a whole lot more coming. And what happens next is Elijah loses his wits and flees to the desert and says, "I'm no better than my fathers." And
after this big miracle, he
runs and hides. And Israel goes right on, unchanged, in idolatry. Jezebel is still in authority. The people are still in idolatry, and Elijah despairs. And that's what causes him to flee to the cave, where he has the encounter with the Lord of the still small voice, which also doesn't work. Right? So he goes and hides in the cave. "Elijah, what are you doing here?" "I'm fleeing for my life because I'm the only one who's faithful. Everyone else is turned away." And he gets the rebuke of 7,000 others who've not been unfaithful. And then there's these revelations: the fire, the earthquake, the wind, and God is not in these things. And somehow we miss that the fire that just fell in the previous chapter, now God is not in that. God's not in the fire. And then, of course, the still small voice or the sound of sheer silence. And Elijah has his face covered, which is a really important detail because it's contrasted with Moses. So Moses also is on the mountain when God draws near. But Moses has his face uncovered with God. He covers it with the people, but uncovers it with God. But here Elijah, even in God's presence, even in this moment, has his face covered. And then God asks him again, "What are you doing here?" And he gives the same answer. So even on that side of that encounter, he remains afraid, remains convinced that he's the only one.
Yeah.
And he doesn't ever fully complete his mission either, right? By the time he's caught up into heaven, he hasn't finished all the things God gave him to do. So I think these are kind of illustrations of because we are convinced that miracles will do this apologetic work for us and evangelistic work, that if we could do if we had more signs and wonders, it would be harder to refute Christianity, and it would be more convincing for people who are not Christian. That's what's in our heads.
Yeah.
But Scripture tells us over and over and over again that's not the way it actually works, and history does too. If we paid attention, it's not. It just doesn't work like that. Whatever faith is, this mysterious work of God that has to do with hiddenness, like if that faith is at work in you, then miracles are recognizable. Oh, this is what God is doing, and you rejoice. But if you don't have faith, they don't seem to be the work of God. They either seem fake or in some way manufactured or evil. And this is why, while we want to believe in a God who does this and pray for them, because we are people of faith, like we recognize it for what it is and thank God for all of that. But we don't want to overvalue what it's going to do in the lives of other people.
Yeah,
as if it's going to have that effect.
So the miracle itself proves what's actually inside of the person, whether the person itself is a person of faith or if the miracle itself is going to continue to confuse the individual.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so in Pentecostal literature, you've done a lot of work with Pentecostal theology. You're on the cusp of where it's at the moment. Do you feel that the movement recognized miracles for not just being a proof producer, but also was something that was deeply revealing of God and the hiddenness in a sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. There are all kinds of ways that there were themes in early Pentecostal preaching that they became muted, but didn't disappear entirely. I mean, even in my youth, I would hear sermons about don't seek the gift, seek the giver. Right. That what matters is knowing God, not knowing the things of God. And they have a passage about the hand of God versus the heart of God. It's all making this same point that there are things God does, but that's not what this is about. It's about who God is. And it's about face-to-face intimacy with God, not a God who performs powerful feats on your behalf. And of course, these are all people who believe God performs powerful feats. But when you have that rooted in this intimacy with God, and Walter Hollenweger, who was the first scholar to write scholarly work about the global Pentecostal movement,
right?
He after studying global Pentecostalism for more than a decade, I think it was published in the late 70s, early 80s, but he was studying basically at that point a 70-year history of Pentecostalism as a movement around the world. And he said that the essence of that Pentecostalism was a blood and wound mysticism and a sharing in the sufferings of the friend Jesus. And that this was the center of the spirituality. So even though, yes, there were miracles, signs, wonders, dreams, visions, speaking in tongues, there were all of these manifestations and openness to the miraculous. It was rooted in a sense of we share in Jesus' sufferings. It was a movement of the poor, not just a movement for the poor. And it was a movement of people who felt that they were suffering, felt called to the suffering, and felt bonded to Jesus in his sufferings. Yeah. And so when they talked about miracles, they're talking about it from that place. Mm-hmm. And somewhere along the way, that started to unhitch. Like we started to talk about the miracles and the feats of power, and we had separated them from the sufferings of Christ and the sufferings of the world.
Yeah, when I was doing my thesis on suffering, I remember there was one of the theologians back in those days, I think it was about 1916, it was in the Bridegroom's Messenger. It was a sermon, and he'd shared that there are 3 levels of knowing God. The first level was through salvation. The second level was through spirit baptism. But then the third level was through suffering. And it was the third and deepest level.
Yes.
That this is how we know God most deeply.
Yes.
Is when we share in his sufferings. And to your point, it seemed like later on that aspect of it sort of became less spoken about.
Absolutely.
And less missed. So, but you're talking about a blood and wound sort of mysticism. Does that make place for the sacraments in a sense and sharing? Because it seems like, kind of shifting the convo a little bit, there's this re-interest in sacramental theology. What does the table of the Lord actually mean? What does it mean to be called to the table of the Lord? How does that play a part in our liturgy? And it's not just, or in times past, I grew up and it was simply just memorialism.
Yeah.
That's all it was.
Yeah.
But now it seems that there's this re-emphasis on the mystery of what's taking place in the sacraments. And so I guess the first question is, speaking to blood and wound mysticism, is there a place for the table in Pentecostal theology that sees it as sacramental?
Absolutely. I mean, there has been historically, and there is also now again in many places. I don't know that it ever completely disappeared, but again, I think it did become a minor note or very muted. But early on, yes, I mean, that Hollenweger in that same book says that the Lord's table is the center of the Pentecostal experience. So, and he's talking about global Pentecostalism across those first 70 years or so of the movement. So there's no doubt that it has been in the past. My PhD work was on this as well. I found the same thing Hollenweger did. And then it dies out in a lot of places, or almost entirely dies out, and then returns. I just yesterday had a conversation with a young man who's working on his PhD now, and his dad was a Pentecostal holiness pastor, and they moved to somewhere in, I'm gonna misremember this now, but I think it was Virginia, to some small Pentecostal holiness church. And when they got there, that church was still doing communion according to the old rubrics in the Pentecostal church, which are more or less straight out of the Book of Common Prayer, Anglican tradition. Yeah. And he talked about, as a kid, realizing that this was beautiful. And so that was still present in places. I know a number of Pentecostals, my parents' and grandparents' age, who were baptized as infants as Pentecostals. So it didn't die out entirely. It just became, the minority report, for sure. But I think what's happening now, is people are realizing we can't live without mystery, and we can't live without the integration of the spiritual and the physical, the heavenly and the earthly. And that's what sacrament is, right? A sacrament is visible and invisible at once. The common way of referring to a sacrament is, an outward sign of an invisible or an inward grace. That's not quite right. I mean, it's not wrong, but it's not quite right, because that still leaves us with this sense of a very clear out and a very clear in, right? But actually a sacrament is a sign that does what it signifies. It does to you what it's symbolizing. Mm-hmm. And we're not, when we're eating bread and drinking wine / grape juice, wine, right, Welch's. Quote unquote, yes, Welch's, we are eating bread and wine, but this bread and wine is sacramentally Christ being given to us. So it's both and. It is this and the other. And I think that longing for integration, for holding together things that seem opposed, and for mystery marks this generation. Yeah,
and then where do you think the connection is? Because as a millennial, someone born in 1984, I just revealed my age here, there was never any sense of we needed this.
Yeah.
It actually wasn't until about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that I really started to notice that the generation behind me,
yes,
Pentecostal charismatics, I mean, as a millennial, thinking about things sacramentally was, we weren't even thinking about it. Yep. And if anybody did bring it up to us, it was like, no interest at all, yep, or even outright opposition to it. Mm-hmm. But the up and coming generation is exploring Pentecostalism, and it's almost like we want to go there, but how do we feel about the sacraments? Mm-hmm. And it's just such an interesting question to me that they want to have this mystery. Where do you think that desire for mystery comes, and why are they looking for it in the sacraments as charismatic Pentecostal people, do you think?
Yeah, and I want to make sure to say, I think that the mystical, the sacramental, the charismatic are actually all aspects of the same reality of mystery, that those things break apart in the modern mind, but they're actually one thing. And instinctively we know this. If I can put it as a Pentecostal, the Lord won't let us forget that. The Spirit keeps leading us back to it because it's true that all those things hold together, but we forgot it. So let me step back for just a moment and say what I think happened and how I think we forgot it. So I think human beings are made to have a kind of dual awareness. What we're meant to live in is glorying mode. Like, to be a human being is to be made for the praise of God, to be the creature that, and the Psalms are filled with this, to be the creature that communicates the praise of God to creation, and communicates the good of creation to God. Like we're in that role of mediator between God and creation and God. And we do that in a way that only a human being can. We're not archangels, we're not kangaroos, we're human beings. And we know a certain way, we feel, we act, we're embodied, we're inspirited. And as this particular kind of creature, our primary mode of living is glorying. It's to give and to receive, to take delight, to take joy, to suffer with. Like that's what we're for. But one aspect of our life is what I want to call the grasping mode. So sometimes I have to put my hands on things. I have to do something in order to fulfill my call as the one who's to glorify God. So grasping mode is like the work of farming. I've got to plow the field and plant the seeds and then harvest them when it's time. And then I can take what I've harvested and I can grind and prepare, and suddenly I have bread, that's come from the work of my hands. But then when I'm ready to receive this bread, I give thanks for it. And in sacrament, I give thanks with it. So I offer this bread to God, who immediately gives it back to me as a gift of his own. So you see there the grasping work of the farmer, preparing the field, planting the seed, all of that, turns into the glorying mode of the congregation, of the priestly people of God, saying to God, thank you. That's what Eucharist means, thanksgiving. And here we give you this bread and this wine in praise. And then we share it together. We feast, right? And that's when we're fulfilling our mode. So the grasping mode serves the glorying mode. We put our hands on things so we can feast, so we can share, so we can give praise to God. But what happens in modernity, in the shift to the modern world, is that we get really, really good at grasping. And this is where you get scientific revolution. This is where you get the industrial revolution. All of this
tech revolution.
What's that?
The tech revolution.
The tech revolution, exactly. All of this stuff is we're getting better and better and better at grasping things. But we lose touch with glorying. So we're farmers who just farm. We never sit down to give thanks. We never turn back to the priestly people of God offering these gifts of bread and wine as gifts. We just consume them. So like when you are stuck in grasping mode, you become a consumer of the very things you make, which is what idolatry is in Scripture. You make a god and then you worship it. Because when you're stuck in that mode of making and taking, you never can give and receive. You're just making and taking. And you close in on yourself, right? And that infects our churches too. And suddenly we start doing ministry in that mode. We start doing ministry in grasping mode. And we're really good at it. And part of the success of what we think of as mega churches, or the way in which we have these evangelistic crusades, healing campaigns. Think about those metaphors.
Yep.
Crusades, campaigns. They're all about grasping, conquering, taking.
Outcomes,
measurable outcomes. We can list the number of people saved. We can list the number of people baptized in the Spirit. And that mode, again, we need that mode. We just can't get stuck in it. And if we never shift out of that mode back to glorying, then we end up worshiping the work of our own hands. Like that's inevitable. And then that's where we lose mystery. And then mystery doesn't seem like the depth of the goodness of God. It seems like something we can't get our hands on, and we hate it. So I think some of what happened to our churches, right at the heart of it, is we were doing ministry in grasping mode, and we got really, really, really good at it. And then our children start to come and realize that it's empty. They recognize the emptiness of it before we did, because we were good at what we were doing.
Right.
So it didn't seem empty to us.
Yeah, and that's almost that's frustrating, because the one thing that is not supposed to be empty is faith and practice and liturgy and things that we have. But yet when we find that empty, and that's the thing that's supposed to be fulfilling to us,
yes,
may leave us with a sense of hopelessness and a sense of what's next.
Absolutely.
And so you feel then Pentecostalism. One thing I love about one of the best descriptors of Pentecostalism that I came across in some of the literature, you may have even said it, is that Pentecostalism is amorphous. And so it finds its way into whatever tradition, that you're a part of.
That's exactly right.
So there's always this sense of, well, Pentecostalism has to be, and we think of, like you said, these televangelists, et cetera, without realizing that, well, there's Anglican Pentecostals and so on and so forth. What's the amorphous aspect of Pentecostalism that makes it so able to seep into tradition?
Because I think we can make a distinction between Pentecostalism or Pentecostal as an adjective and Pentecostal as a noun. So if we think of it as an adjective, we're describing a sensibility, a way of seeing the world that I think is about openness to God and a confidence that for God nothing is impossible. And that's, not somehow the possession of people who call themselves Pentecostal. I think that's the character of people who've been touched by God. But the Pentecostal movement, at least the way that I would understand it, is a movement of God to remind the church and the world, you should be open to me. Jamie Smith has a wonderful little book called Thinking in Tongues. And in there, he gives a kind of description of what he calls the Pentecostal worldview. And I think he's exactly right. And I think what he's naming, and he gives 5 characteristics of that worldview, but one of them is this kind of openness to the God who can do anything, a living God who speaks and acts and who can do anything.
Yeah, it may have been in Sanctifying Interpretation or your thesis, but when I was doing my methodology chapter, I was trying to answer the question of what is Pentecostalism? I mean, who even has the ability to say and speak, say what it is? But I think you've outlined 8 things about trying to get your hands around what Pentecostalism actually is. So if somebody asks you, well, what is Pentecostalism? What would you how would you describe it?
So in terms of adjectives, I think in the broadest sense, it's having been touched by God in such a way that you come to be convinced that God is a living God for whom all things are possible. But then what spills from that in various shapes and forms in different contexts is an embodied way of living that bears witness to this. And this is why I think testimony is so essential. Like that's another kind of family resemblance that you recognize across all the differences of Pentecostal people and Pentecostal people who go by some other name. I mean, most Pentecostals belong to the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church or, fill in the blank with your denomination. But they've been touched by God. They've been opened up to this God for whom nothing is impossible, and they testify about it, right? And that, I think, has reshaped the face of global Christianity and has reoriented the church back to confidence in this God who is mysterious, right? Whose ways are not our ways. So I think another aspect of Pentecostalism is the response to what we call the altar. The reason, and I think that should be closely tied to communion table. That's maybe another conversation for another day. But that the altar call as an invitation for the people of God to come back and meet with the Lord, to open their hearts and their lives up to God again and again and again. I think this is another mark of what it means to be Pentecostal. And that can take all kinds of expression. Like that doesn't look and sound and feel the same in every place. But that's going to show up over and over again. Testimony about what God is doing, a call to the altar over and over and over again, where you're being asked to lay your all there. I think another mark of it is it's a kind of lay monastic movement. So it's calling for taking God seriously in every aspect of your life. Not that all Pentecostals, who call themselves Pentecostals anyway, do this, but I think that when it's genuine, when the spirituality is genuinely present, there is this sense of my whole life belongs to God. There's nothing in my life that's not touched by Him.
That was probably when I started first reading Pentecostal literature in my 3rd section, my reception. You always start. Chris Thomas always had us starting with apostolic faith. It's the heart of the movement. You can't. If you don't have that in there, you don't have a reception. And the first thing I noticed is that there are these women who are touched by the Spirit's presence. And there's one particular story that kept repeating over and over again. It's this woman on her way to Liberia with a one-way ticket.
Yes.
To preach the gospel. And then she would write back from time to time in correspondence with the offices about what's happening.
Yes.
But then she kind of stops writing, and you kind of really don't know exactly what happened to her.
Yeah.
And the thing about it is that you think, well, if they have anything, they have deep commitment.
Definitely.
To the gospel that they're preaching.
Yes.
To your point.
That's what I mean by lay. It's a kind of democratic or egalitarian monasticism. It's God calls all of us to holiness. God calls all of us to radical devotion. God calls all of us to mission. And that's another mark of the movement. And again, that has Catholic expression, that has Baptist expression, that has, of course, expression in our classical Pentecostal denominations too. So it's not so much about style. It looks different, it feels different, but that keeps showing up. This sense of radical commitment. My life is on the altar. It's not my will, but God's will that matters. And I do think that's the truth of the good of the Pentecostal movement and its spirituality. I think, unfortunately, so much of that comes unraveled. And what we think of now, when we think about the Pentecostal charismatic movement, at least what many of us are going to think about, are caricatures, through TV and
which came after several different waves and transformations of the movement.
And I would encourage people to make a distinction between conventional and popular forms and representations of Pentecostalism and the spirituality kind of at its truest. So just because it has enormous kind of footprint doesn't mean it's actually representative. So I think that genuine Pentecostalism, if we can call it that, the real deal, isn't always what you're going to see on the biggest stages or on the screens. You're going to run into it in some small church in an alley somewhere where there are 40 people in the room, but the spirituality is authentic there.
Yeah,
and we need kind of, I think we all know that, but we lose touch with that when we're describing what we're experiencing, because most of us are experiencing what's most accessible, and what's most accessible is what's on the screen.
Yeah, and very rarely do people ever take a look at the first Pentecostal literature that's out there to see that this movement that was taking shape, it had its spearhead, it had its leaders, but the power of the movement was in the lonely unknowns.
Absolutely right.
That were out there giving everything that they had because they had been so profoundly touched by the Spirit. There's individuals that were giving up their jobs, giving up their lives. They were deeply concerned with what was taking place in the world.
Yes.
The famine in India being one example.
A great example, yes.
They kept talking about that.
Yes.
For a while, it was just this famine in India. We need to raise money. We need to be out there. There was things taking place in Korea at that time that they were deeply concerned about.
Part of what you're putting your finger on here, Chris, is that when we talk about the Pentecostal movement, again, back to grasping mode for just a second. When you go into, I had shoulder surgery a couple of months ago. When you go into a doctor's office, on the wall, it's just as part of the decor, are these charts of the human body, right? But that's no particular person's body. It's an idealized model of kind of all the working parts that are there. But it's not a living body. It's not anybody's body. It's an ideal one, right? And in grasping mode, we see the world that way. We break it up into pieces and into parts, but it's not actually in touch with what's real, with what's really going on. And we can do this with ministry. We can do this with history. We can do this with theology, where we break things into parts, but we lose touch with what's actually happening, the real lived body, the real lived ministry. And so many of the ways we've come to think about Pentecostalism is like that. We think of things like speaking in tongues, the power of the Spirit, the miraculous. And those things are, let's say, prominent and noisy. But when you actually study the lived history of these people, that's not where their emphasis is. So, here's a great example of it. Agnes Osman was the woman who spoke in tongues at the watch night service at Charles Parham's Bible School in 1901 that is often called the beginning of the Pentecostal movement. And I'm thinking about this because of what you said about India. And in fact, the Pentecostal movement has multiple starting points around the world at more or less the same time. There's no one single route. right? It's happening. It's like crabgrass. It's happening all over the world at the same time. But Agnes Osmond, she speaks in tongues. They're having this watch night service. They're doing communion at this watch night service, and she starts speaking in tongues. So she's very quickly lauded as the first woman to speak in tongues since the apostolic age. So that's the way they talk about it. But within a few years, she starts traveling the world, speaking about her experience. And what she says over and over and over again is, I don't want to be known as the woman who spoke in tongues. I don't want our movement to be known as a movement of tongues. I'm seeking God. I want to be known as a woman who is seeking God, not a woman who is seeking a sign, because it's an evil generation that seeks a sign. Mm-hmm. So notice how when we pull it apart into pieces and we think Pentecostalism is speaking in tongues. But the woman who actually lived that said, don't reduce me to the woman who spoke in tongues. I'm the woman who was seeking the fullness of God. That's who I want to be.
Yeah.
That's the lived reality. And that's genuine Pentecostalism, right? Mm-hmm. Is there speaking of tongues? Of course there is. But we're not seeking the sign. We're seeking the Spirit. And if we lose touch with that, which is what happens when we get in grasping mode, we lose touch, of course, with God, but we also lose touch with our own history, with our own, and tragically, I think many of our Pentecostal churches are still calling themselves Pentecostal, but they've really betrayed their own inheritance. They've lost touch with what it was that made our movement a work of God in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy to see the miracles that are taking place in the testimonies, but not really see what is undergirding those.
Absolutely.
One of the elements that I made use of, there was an article called Pentecost at a Funeral. And it was this whole entire story about this pastor and his wife. And there was a grieving woman because she had lost her newborn. I think it was 4 months old.
Yeah.
And there was in that testimony, but at the very beginning and outright, she lost the baby. Mm-hmm. It's not coming back. They didn't try to raise it from the dead. But the touching thing about the entire thing was how they grieved with that woman.
They grieved with her, yes. That's right.
They didn't try to fix it.
Yes.
They didn't try to give her some sort of answer or apologetic for God. Mm-hmm. They just simply showed up. They sung hymns with her. They comforted her. And the woman starts to experience this joyous presence of the Spirit, knowing that she's going to see her child again. But all of that came about because they shouldered up and they grieved with that woman. And so I made use of that section because I felt like this wasn't a one-off.
That's right.
This was a microcosm of what's taking place in all the literature, is this sense of unity, and we are sharing in the same Spirit and sharing in the same body.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is why there's so much talk in that early literature about tears, the gift of tears, the groans of Romans 8. They don't separate the groans of Romans 8 from the tongues of 1 Corinthians. And there is that, you mentioned the sermon, suffering is the deepest intimacy with God. I mean, that shows up over and over and over again. And one more example of that I love, J.H. King has a sermon about Ishmael and Isaac, and as a kind of type of the work of God in our lives. And he says, first God calls us to give up those things that should never have been in our life in the first place, Ishmael. Then he calls us to give up those things that he put in our life, Isaac. And that real intimacy with God comes not when you give up Ishmael, because that should never have been in your life in any way, but when you give up Isaac. And then he specifically says Isaac is a type of our charismatic experience and the ecstasy we feel when we experience God. And he says, to know God truly is to not love the way you feel when God acts on your life, but to love God.
Wow.
Right? So not only is there this move into the suffering of my neighbor, grieving with those who grieve, groaning, but there's a move into God past the way I feel when God is acting. And that's authentic Pentecostalism. And if that's the root and the ground of the spirituality, then the miracles, the prophecies, the dreams and visions, that they're rooted in that lived share in Christ's sufferings. And that becomes a witness to the Jesus of the cross. Another thing that will show up over and over and over in this literature is that the Christ who pours out the Spirit is the Christ of the cross. So you get, there's a a message in tongues in one of these services. And this is later. This isn't in the early literature, but it's resonant with it. A message in tongues, and the interpretation is the Spirit is given from the cross. The Spirit is given from the cross, so that when Jesus breathes his last, like this is the beginning of Pentecost. It's the Christ of the cross who pours out his Spirit on us. Yep. And like that is the blood and wound mysticism. Mm-hmm. That is the grieving, the concern for the famine in India. Like that's the energy that's authentic. And again, because of the grasping mode, a lot of us, not everybody by any means, but a lot of us lost touch with that and betrayed that calling. And I think some of what's happening now is the younger generations are recognizing the emptiness, the vacuity of what we built.
Yeah, it should be deeper. By all means, they know it should be deeper, but where is that at?
Yeah.
And quick question as we kind of shift gears.
Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes left. For those that are listening that want to be a scholar and they hear kind of what you're saying and the deep insights that you have, can you share a little bit about how Chris Green became Chris Green and what you kind of do in your daily life as a scholar and as a pastor, or I should say a bishop, or is it bishop or?
Yeah. I mean, I wish that weren't true, but unfortunately it is. Yeah. This is one of the things that, like in the church's history, pretty much everybody who's a bishop was made against their will.
Exactly.
And that's certainly true in my case.
Yeah. So I know I admire you. I know that there are students that admire you deeply. So maybe share a little bit of your background about how you discipline your life and maybe what you do to press into.
Yeah, I think some of it is it's an accident. Like and hopefully calling, right? Something God called me to. But I think it's a love for learning, and a love for learning about God and the things of God, because that draws me closer to God. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer has this wonderful little lecture he gave to students who are considering becoming theologians. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things he says is, this is not for everybody. You shouldn't try to make this happen. You should try to do something else. You should only do this if it's the age-old advice about any ministry. Don't do it if you can do something else. Mm-hmm. Right? But then he says, but you don't have to expect to have some dramatic call. If you love the truth, and if you love the God of the truth, and if you find yourself drawn back again and again and again to wanting to know, to understand, then you probably have a calling. So I would say, to start with, pay attention to whether or not you feel that draw to know and to understand, like to really understand, like to think it through, not so you can appear smart, but so you can genuinely recognize, oh, this is true and this is why it's true, and in a way that draws you more intimately toward God, not leaving you with a sense of, now I have the knowledge, because that's grasping mode, right? But in a way that you're wondering at how incredible it is that that's true. I think the best theologians are people who never get over being amazed and astonished at the goodness of God and the wisdom of God, and they love learning about that. Not talking about it, learning about it. So I think if you want to be a theologian, if that's in you, that's a work of the Spirit in you, lean into that and learn what you can, and always check yourself to make sure you're doing it in glorying mode. Like, there's times in which you have to grasp things. You got to work hard. I mean, as you know, like you're not going to get the degrees you and I've gotten without
punishment,
some serious pain in your life. It's going to come by sweat and blood.
Yeah.
You're going to earn it, and you should earn it. Like, I mean, it is hard work, and it should be hard work. I say to students all the time, like, if you were pursuing being an astronaut, or you were pursuing being a brain surgeon or a cosmologist or whatever, like you would expect it to be hard.
Yeah.
You would expect for people to say things you don't understand, and for you to have to read books you can't really read, and to learn languages. And
it's like, how would you feel if your pilot said his training wasn't difficult?
Right, exactly. What if your pilot says he did his degree, in 6 weeks online? Like, I really don't think I'm comfortable with this, right? So I think we want it to be hard, not unnecessarily hard. I mean, sometimes people will say to me, you have a gift for making complex things simple. And I always resist them and say, no, I do not have a gift for that, because that would be a lie. To make a complex thing simple would be to distort its truth. What I want to do is make complex things clear in their complexity.
That's really good.
Right. I don't want to make them simple. I want to make simple things simple.
Say that again. You want to make complex things clear in their complexity. So not reduce them to the lowest common denominator.
Absolutely right.
But to actually just be clear, which is probably more difficult to do, is to use clarifying language around something rather than just to reduce it to something it's not.
It's incredibly hard to do. And it takes a long time of learning and listening and reading and pondering and praying to even start to understand it enough to be able to say, okay, maybe we could talk about it this way.
That's one thing. One of the first things I learned from you is when we were at the table at Bangor, and one of your students, I don't know if it was one of your students or one of the students that were there, was kind of in the weeds. And you had a way of getting them out of the weeds that was really impressive. But I noticed that you were synthesizing really well. And that was the first chapter of my thesis, is that I have all these books, all these people I'm learning from. And then my first draft of it got sent back to me because I was getting them wrong.
Yes.
I was talking about this person and this, and it was all wrong. Then I realized how difficult it was to actually synthesize.
Very difficult.
And then to make everything harmonize in a way.
Yes.
And it made me realize how much I've done this in my entire life.
Yeah.
And it's just simply synthesizing. But you're saying that it's the drawing of the Spirit for the love of God that causes you to be able to do that.
Well, it's a kind of magnetic pull on your life. You just can't not do it. I mean, I know we're out of time, but one of the things that's funny, I went back to the Bible school where I went in the 90s, the Pentecostal Bible School in Bethany, Southwestern. It was Southwestern College of Christian Ministries at the time. Later became Southwestern University. I don't know what it is with Pentecostals and directions, but we're at Southeastern now. I did a master's degree at Southwestern Assemblies of God, but that was Southwestern Pentecostal Holiness Bible School.
Right.
But anyway,
it's like the Baptist, First Baptist, Second Baptist.
Yes. Yeah, we have our own nomenclature. But I went back years later, and I went down into the library looking for a book for some reason, and I was scanning, and I pulled a book off a shelf, and back in the day, that you had library cards that you put your name in for when you checked it out last. And I pulled the book off the shelf, and when I opened it up, my name was the last one in it, like 10 years earlier, right? And so I kind of smiled and thought, oh, and so I started pulling the theology books off the shelf and opening them up, and over again, my name was the last name in the library card. So I spent a lot of time, the bulk of my life, in places like that reading. So I think a lot of it comes down to, for every minute or two or a conversation like this one, there are hours, days, weeks, months of study behind every conversation. So don't be a theologian if you want to have something to say. Be a theologian if you want to learn. And then you'll have something to say at some point, maybe. But the goal is to learn it and to glory in it.
That's great advice, Chris. You have a Substack?
I do. I did. I wake up to a new world every day. So as of yesterday, yes, it's Speakeasy Theology, which I know is a risky title for a Pentecostal.
I love it. I'm always on it all the time, man. I think it's great. I found that a couple of years, was it 2 years ago or something? I've been reading it ever since.
Part of the reason I did that, and again, we can edit this out if you want, but part of the reason I did the Speakeasy that way and called it Speakeasy, of course, back in the day, speakeasies, they didn't have signage. They didn't advertise themselves. You had to go find it. You had to go find them, and you had to know the code at the door.
Yep.
And I had this impression several years ago that the presence I was having online was counterproductive for people learning theology. That so when you're on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and you're sharing in a public way without any real clear sense of who's hearing you and what they're going to do with what they're hearing. And what I realized is there's a certain way I wanted to engage issues, but people needed to seek it out. I didn't want to broadcast it in a way that kind of threw it out in front of everyone, like, street preacher yelling at the traffic.
Just noise.
There's a time for that.
Yeah.
There's a time for that.
But you're not trying to make a bunch of noise in the void.
But not with these topics, with my calling. So don't misunderstand me. I'm not against those other kinds of presences. But I realize for me, given the work I wanted to do, it's work people need to seek out or they won't engage it the right way. And it completely shifted the kind of engagement I got.
That's brilliant.
And I think the Lord directed me to it, because what was happening is I was trying to share something from my heart, thinking I was talking to one group of people, but I was actually just infuriating another group. So I'm spending all my time fighting with them, and they're not even the people I'm talking to.
Yeah.
You know? And by shifting the mode, I was able to kind of figure out, okay, these people are seeking it out. They're asking for this conversation, so I can speak to them.
Yep.
And then I'm not having to spend hours of my day, fighting with those knuckleheads.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's brilliant advice for young people that are, and not just young people, but leaders that are looking to speak in a more broad sense, not to just go after the echo chamber.
Yeah, just make sure that what you're doing online is fitted to what you're called to be as a person.
Yep.
And we all have different callings, so there's no rules about that. But I think you want that to be aligned.
Fantastic. Chris, thanks for being on, man.
Absolutely. Thank you.